I'm Marika from My Creative Quilts, and today I'm going to talk to you about how to put a binding on. A few weeks ago I put out a call for people asking what they would like to learn, and that is a topic that came up quite often. There are different ways you can do bindings. I did many different ways before I learned this technique several years ago, which I prefer. And by all means, use the one that's better for you. You might not like the way I do it, or you may take a few tips from the way I do it and combine it with how you've been doing it. So whatever feels comfortable for you, you can look up different videos, you can follow what I do, but this is the method that I use the most often. In fact, pretty well all the time. It's rare that I'll do a different kind of binding. So I just finished quilting a baby quilt. Turned out quite nicely. So I thought this would be a good place to start to show you how I do my binding. I'm using a 2-inch binding. For my bigger quilts I do 2.5 inches, but I made a 2 inches one. If you need to know how to sew your binding together, I can do a separate one, or you can just Google it. It's really easy. Pretty well everybody does that the same way. I roll my binding up, and I'm going to show you why in a minute. So for preparation, you need your quilt, you need your binding, you need your thread. Some people have asked what kind of color thread I use. I tend to be pretty consistent with the piecing and the binding. If I used a thinner thread for the piecing, I might use a thicker thread for the binding, because it actually is what puts up with a lot of the abuse, especially with baby quilts or kids quilts, when they might be putting the bindings in their mouth and tugging on them. So it really is up to you, but I tend to use a more sturdier thread for the bindings for quilts that I know will be, or I hope will be, well loved. So let's go to the machine. Okay, so first I'm going to talk to you about the binding. I have my binding all rolled up, because like I said, that's how I like to do it, and this is why. Not all sewing machines have spindles that stand up straight, but if you have one that stands up straight, that's great. What I have is a spindle that will fit on my bobbin winder, and so that does it. So now that I've rolled this up, I just slide it on the spindle, and there we go. I don't have to worry about where my binding is. See, it just works really well, and ever since I started doing this, I've had no problems with bindings, throwing them over my shoulder, dropping them on the floor, rolling all over the place. I think this is one of my better ideas. So that's my binding all ready to go. Okay, now for the quilt. So I tend not to start in any particular spot. Many years ago I read that you're not supposed to start at the bottom or the top where it might be really visible. I don't really care. I don't really notice it once I put it on, but I just pick a spot where I'm going to start. And so what we're going to do is we're going to sew the binding on, go all the way around, and we're leaving a gap, because don't forget we have to close the binding. Before I learned how to do this technique, one I tried was doing just like 4 bindings and then fastening them on the corner. That was awkward. I left a lot of bumps, so this one for me is the smoothest. So I'm going to switch to my 1/4 inch foot. If you don't have a 1/4 inch foot, just make sure you know where your 1/4 inch is for your stitching. And I'm making sure that there's enough thread in my bobbin. Sometimes you like to play chicken and hope that the thread will last. So I have enough, my machine is threaded, the bobbin has plenty of thread in it, my stitches are all put, so now we are going to start. Now if I have a really big quilt that I'm working on, I will put either my portable cutting table beside here or an ironing board at this level, and it will hold the weight of the quilt. A baby quilt, it's fine, I can do it in this small space, but once I have a bigger quilt, I need something else to hold the weight, or I just don't have enough room to work. So use whatever works for you, but I just happen to have a smaller area. Before I had my long arm, I had a much bigger table and I had more room to spread, but we have to make choices, right? I wanted my long arm machine, so I had to have a smaller sewing setup. So I've got my binding here. Now this is where I don't pin. Some people do. I don't. Do whatever is more comfortable for you, but I don't bother pinning because it's going at a pretty decent speed that I can control it. So the things that we need to remember is you have to start, you don't start at the front because you're going to need to be able to join them together. So I probably leave about this much. So when you're cutting your binding, you're measuring the outside of the quilt for how much binding you need, and then you need to add several inches because you're going to have to be able to join them. So unless you're really tight on fabric, give yourself a good healthy chunk of tail end for the binding so you don't have to worry about making the ends meet, literally. Okay, so I've got my 1/4 foot. I'm going to start about here. I pick any spot. Before I started doing this, I checked after I trimmed and squared my quilt to make sure that the edges were all even. Now, some people like to serge the end, or they like to zigzag the end. What I might do is stay stitch the edges if there's a lot of small pieces that where the seams could separate, and then when you're pulling and tugging and quilting, that can come undone. So I might stay stitch the edge. This is a fairly thin quilt, so I'm not going to worry about zigzagging it or serging it or anything like that. But if you feel more comfortable doing that, by all means go ahead. There's no reason why you shouldn't. It's entirely up to you. Okay, so I'm going to start about here, and I just line up. So you see I'm lining up the binding to the edge of the quilt, and it's just going to be consistent. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go sew down to the corner, and I'm going to show you how I turn the corner for a miter, and then I'm just going to quickly sew around and then show you how to do the joining. Okay, so here we go. I'm going to put down my foot. Now don't forget to backstitch, because when you're joining it, it's very easy to pull. Some people say not to backstitch here because if they've made a mistake, they can pull it out easily. I don't have any problem unsewing or picking out stitches if it has been backstitched. I feel more comfortable backstitching and making sure it's secure. So I'm just going to backstitch a couple of stitches here, and now I'm going to sew down. So it's just a regular size stitch, nothing big, nothing small, just whatever you used for your piecing. If it's nice and solid, it doesn't matter. Sometimes if I haven't trimmed the edges completely properly, sometimes I make a mistake and I wobble and so I might end up getting too close to the edge. It might not be totally even, and then I'll do a second seam to compensate for that. It doesn't happen often, but you can find ways to cope. Now another thing to watch out for is when you've pressed your binding together, wrong sides together, sometimes it's easy for one edge of the binding to go over and it's not exactly even. You've got to check for that, because I've had times where I have not checked for that, and then when I flipped over the binding, I've seen that it hasn't caught in the stitching, so that's really important too. Okay, so I'm just going to continue sewing, and then here's the important part for a good mitered corner. I'm going to stop a 1/4 of an inch before. Now it can be hard to eyeball it. I can, because I'm used to doing it. What you can do is before you start, just measure a 1/4 of an inch so you know where to stop. So I'm just going to do one more stitch. Okay, and then you back up, and then you cut it. Okay, you're not cutting the binding, you're cutting the thread. Oops, I just cut it twice. All right, so you can see I stopped, and actually, that's about it. Okay, so now how to do the miter. This is actually fun. You have your binding straight like this. You have your side straight like this, okay? So you fold it up like this, okay? See, I've made a diagonal line straight from the corner down like this. Finger press it down, okay? Then you fold it down again like this, okay? So look, see, you have that, okay? So you put it straight, fold it up from the corner, make your diagonal line like this, and then bring it down like this. And see how that looks? Okay, I'll show you again on the next corner. So here we go. So then you put it down, and then you backstitch again, because you really want to make sure this holds, right? Now it's important to make sure that the bottom square, the bottom piece of fabric, see this little piece of fabric here, stays straight underneath. Double check it, because there have been times where I've been rushing it and this has been bigger and it's been folded down underneath, and I don't know that until I go to sew the back down. So just be careful about that. Okay, so I backstitched, and now I'm just going to straight stitch right down the side again. It's very hot. We're in the middle of a big heat wave, and houses here in Montreal, older houses, it's hard to put in central air conditioning. Our house was built in 1931, so I looked into it. It would have been cost prohibitive, so it's a little bit hot. There were thunderstorms, so I haven't heard any thunder yet, but It's not really quilting leather, let's put it that way. Okay, here we're cutting up to the next corner. Let me just unroll a bit more of my binding, and again I'm going and I'm going to stop 1/4 of an inch to the edge. Back stitch, cut, and lift. So now, again, making it straight, make sure it lines up, make sure I'm 1/4 of an inch, fold it up. So you're making a diagonal line like this. Then you're folding this down so it's even with the edge. And you go right back to it. Okay, so now we're getting close to where we started. So I'm just going to continue going a little bit here. And some people recommend a certain number of inches between that you leave in between. I just kind of eyeball it. I think whatever looks comfortable for me. I'm probably going to do a little bit more here. As long as you have enough room to work with, some people, you know, it really is personal preference. So I'm going to leave about this much room to work with. So that's it. So I'm going to back stitch again to make sure it holds. And now I'm going to we're going to go over to the cutting table so I can show you how I join the binding. Okay, now we're ready for attaching the binding. I've tried many different ways to do it, and I was never really happy with any of the techniques that I learned. I was using credit cards, I was using just folding over, I was doing it at the machine, and I was never happy with how it looked until I bought this a few years ago. It's a binding tool. There are a few of them that you can buy. This one is called the Cut Right Bind Up. I like it. No matter how many quilts I've made, I still always have to look at the instructions to make sure I've got it right. But it makes, for me, it makes binding a lot easier. So you're going to need a cutting board, and you're going to need to be able to press your quilt. So you take your quilt, and you're at the end. Now these are where I want these to join. Now I have a lot more fabric than I really need, but I prefer to have more fabric than to not have enough. So we're going to be joining them here. Now the reason it's important to join it properly is you want to have the angled join, because that way when you're sewing down your seam, you're not getting big bumps where the seams are. So the first thing you do, if you're using this tool, is you fold like this, and you fold like this. Okay, so you have the meeting. I tend to leave a little bit of a space in between, because I found if I make it a tight fit, then I get a bit of a wobble once it's all put together. That bugs me when I look at it. So that's how I do it. So here we go. So I put it about halfway down, and I folded that down. And then this one, leaving a little bit of a spot. Now we need this marked. Finger pressing doesn't really work, because I'll show you why. You need a good stiff seam there. So you just press that down for a minute. Okay. So now when you open it, you have your intersection. This is this seam here, and this is the seam that we just placed in there, and the same on this side. So now we need to mark it. If you're able to do really crisp seams, or seams, then you don't really have to mark it. It depends on the mood I'm in, to tell you the truth. But because I'm showing you, I'll do it properly. So then this is a marker that wears away, but sometimes I use pencil. It just depends on what I happen to have close at hand. Okay, so now comes the cutting part. So let me just flip this over. Now we're going to do some cutting. This is where you need to be careful, but if you make a mistake, there's extra fabric that we can attach to the binding and start over again. It's not the end of the world. I haven't made too many mistakes doing this. I haven't had to do it too often, but it's salvageable. Unless you have absolutely no fabric left, it's salvageable. So now you're opening this up, okay? So I have my binding straight like this. I turn it like this, and I open it up, okay? So now I'm going to want to cut an angle, and this is where this comes in really handy, okay? You start with the left side, and there says L for left. If you turn it over, it says R for right. So you know which side to use, okay? I'm just gonna show you what the instructions. So I've pressed, and then I've opened the binding, okay? Or do it this way, whichever way works, okay? And then you take this, and the reason you made the marks here is because you're gonna line them up like this. So I'm lining up the marks like that. Let me see if I can zero in on that for you. Okay, so there are the lines. Here's the line. And then you take your rotary cutter. I have a little tiny rotary cutter that I like to use for this. I'm not sure where it is right now, so it's lined up there. Now this is where you have to be careful you don't get overly enthusiastic. Okay, so you just very carefully cut like this. Okay, you don't want to cut too far, you don't want to cut the quilt. And then it has this so that you can cut off the ear. There we go. So that part's done. Then we're moving this over a little bit, and we're going to do the same thing on the other side. But the important thing is to make sure that you're using the right side of the ruler. It might sound complicated the way I'm showing you, but once you've tried it, you'll see it really is pretty easy. Okay, so now this was the left side that I used here. I need to turn it over like this because I want the right. And it's the same thing. This is going to fit here, right on the line. Okay, this is what I don't like cutting like this. It's not safe, but it's really the only way you can do it. So just go like that carefully. Oops, I did not do a good job there. It's because it's pretty awkward. Okay, and then you cut off the little ear again. And there you go. So now what we're going to do is join these together like this, and you will have your binding. It's very easy to twist it. I've done that a few times, and then you just need to take it out again and try one more time. So I'm just going to pin this. Here are my pins. It's going to pin it. Now if I've cut it properly, everything should meet. Okay, I just have to make sure I'm not twisting it. It's very frustrating. You're at the end of a quilt, you're at the last step, and then you do that, and you look at it and you go, shoot, I twisted it. I have to take it out and start over again. And there. One or two pins, whichever is easiest for you. So then we're going to go sew a quarter of an inch there, and I'll be right back for the rest of it. Okay, I'm back from the machine. You can see I sewed together the two separate strips, and now if you put it like this, you'll see how it meets like that. So I'm just going to go back to the machine for a minute and sew this down, and then I'll be back to show you the next step. And here it's sewn together. See how nice that looks? That's where I joined it. That's where I joined it. No. Yeah, that's where I joined it. So it's just, you really can't, once it's all bound, you're not going to be able to tell where I started it and where I finished it. So the next step I do, you don't have to do, I've just learned that I find it makes it easier for me to sew down the binding, is I use my iron and I press the binding away from the quilt. I just do that because it makes it easier to flip it over to the back to sew it together. So I'm just going to quickly do that. Okay, we're almost finished. Now this is how you put on the binding if you're going to hand sew it to the back. Some people either can't hand sew because they have arthritis or some problems with their hands, and some of them just don't like to do it. So if that's the case, what you have to do is, you can see that I attach the binding to the front of the quilt because I'm going to be turning it back. If you're machine sewing the binding down, you do it in the reverse. You sew down the binding in the back, you bring it to the front, and then you can sew it down. I've not had a lot of luck with machine binding. I probably will try again one day, but the 2 times I tried it, I had to take it out and do it all over again by hand. Okay, so I pressed my binding back, and you can see that the corners are nicely mitered, and I mitered my corners on the quilt top too, so that really makes for a nice effect. So the next step is sometime this week, I'm going to sit down and watch some good TV or a movie or something, and then I'm just going to spend the evening sewing this down like this. You just do like a whip stitch or a back stitch, whatever you're most comfortable with. You can hide it. I still have to put a label on this quilt. What I do is I tend to put them in the corner before I put the binding on, and that way I can put the binding around. Some people like to put triangle labels on there. Whatever floats your boat, whatever you like to do. But that's the final step. Some people hate binding, especially hand sewing, but I like it. To me, it's the completion of the quilt. It's the last step. It makes me sit down and really relax, which is something I don't do often enough. And it's just something I did. In fact, last night I finished sewing on the binding for a king-size quilt I just finished. That took a little while, but it was fine. I just watched a whole, I think I binge watched the English game. The English game was about soccer or football, as they call it there, and when it became a popular sport. That was interesting. It was 6 series. So anyway, going off topic here. So that's how you do a binding. If you have any questions, let me know, and I will see if I can help you. And I'll see you next time. Goodbye.